Did you approve a work permit for the Morgan residence? She demanded without preamble. Yes, Karen. Daryl sounded unusually confident. Judge Morgan submitted proper documentation, and we expedited approval. You can't expedite without board approval. I'm the president. Check the bylaws, Karen. Section 8. Paragraph 5 allows any 3 committee members to approve emergency aesthetic corrections. We had 4 signatures. Karen's grip tightened on her phone. This wasn't how things were done in Whispering Pines. She marched to the Morgan's front door and rang the bell aggressively. Jessica answered, expression wary. Your mother is circumventing proper HOA procedures, Karen stated, and you still owe a fine for your discourteous behavior. Jessica remained remarkably poised. Mom said to give you this if you came by. She handed Karen an envelope. Inside was a check for $300, exactly covering the 3 days of fines, and a note on judicial letterhead. Ms. Whitaker, I've complied with the mailbox requirements. Regarding my daughter's alleged discourtesy, I've reviewed Section 29 and found no specific prohibition against calling a rule ridiculous. Words matter in both law and bylaws. Also, please find enclosed my application to run for the HOA board in next month's election. Karen felt the ground shift beneath her designer sandals. No one had opposed her for the board in 3 years. She looked up to see Jessica still in the doorway, a small smile playing at her lips. My mom says the bylaws only require residents of 6 months to run for office. We've been here 7. The contractor finished the mailbox, nodding respectfully to Karen as he packed up his supplies. Perfect match to your color sample, ma'am. Judge, make sure we got it exactly right. Karen retreated to her compliance center, mind racing. A federal judge on the HOA board would upset the delicate power balance she'd cultivated. She pinned Judge Morgan's note to her violation board and poured a glass of Chardonnay. Despite it being only 11 a.m., she needed to strategize. That afternoon, she called an emergency board meeting, citing community harmony concerns. 5 board members, all handpicked by Karen over the years, gathered in her living room. Elaine Morgan is running for the board, she announced gravely, as though revealing a terminal diagnosis. She'll try to dismantle everything we've built. Daryl shifted uncomfortably. I've reviewed her application. She actually has some good ideas about making the approval process more efficient. Karen shot him a withering look. Efficiency undermines thoroughness. We need to present a united front against this interloper. But something had changed. The board members exchanged glances, and Karen realized with horror that they'd already been talking amongst themselves. Daryl cleared his throat. Karen, we've discussed this. Maybe some fresh perspectives would benefit the community. The judge seems reasonable. Betrayal burned in Karen's chest. After everything she'd done to maintain their perfect neighborhood, they were ready to welcome an outsider who didn't understand the delicate ecosystem of rules and enforcement she'd cultivated. Fine, she said, voice dangerously quiet. If that's how you feel, I'll handle this myself. As the board members filed out, Karen opened her laptop. If Judge Morgan wanted to play community politics, she was about to learn that federal authority meant nothing in the trenches of Homeowner Association warfare. Karen began drafting a special newsletter to all residents, detailing how a newcomer was attempting to fundamentally transform their beloved community. The battle lines were drawn, but Karen didn't realize she was bringing citation pads to a legal gunfight. Winter gave way to spring in Whispering Pines, and with it came the blossoming, not just of Karen's meticulously planned community garden, but of unexpected new growth in her personal life. Her son Tyler's weekend visit had stretched into a month, then 2, as he expressed interest in finishing his senior year of high school in his mother's neighborhood. His father, seeing a positive change in both his ex-wife and his son, had reluctantly agreed to a modified custody arrangement. On this particular Saturday morning, Karen was supervising the installation of a gazebo in the community garden, a project she proposed and the HOA had unanimously approved. Her clipboard contained diagrams with precise measurements, but her tone with the volunteers was encouraging rather than dictatorial. "Mom, the judge is here," Tyler called out, wheeling over an extra bag of mulch he had taken to calling Elaine Morgan simply the judge, with teenage irreverence that somehow conveyed respect. Judge Morgan approached, casual in gardening clothes, trailed by the twins who carried flats of petunias. Karen still felt a momentary tightening in her chest whenever she saw the judge, muscle memory from their initial confrontation, but it was fading with each positive interaction. "The gazebo looks perfect," the judge commented, surveying the structure. "Exactly 3 feet from the pathway, as specified in the proposal." Karen caught the gentle teasing in her tone. "Some rules are worth keeping," she replied with a small smile. They worked side by side, an unlikely alliance that had become the cornerstone of Whispering Pines' renaissance. The community newsletter, now edited by a committee rather than Karen alone, had recently featured their story as an example of turning conflict into collaboration. "The board position is opening again next month," Judge Morgan mentioned casually as they planted flowers. "You should consider running." Karen nearly dropped her trowel. "No one would vote for me." "Don't be so sure. Your beautification committee has transformed the neighborhood." People noticed dedication. Before Karen could respond, a commotion near the garden entrance caught their attention. A man in an expensive suit was arguing with Daryl, gesturing angrily at a folder of documents. "That's Geoffrey Hammond," Karen whispered. "The developer trying to buy the empty parcel behind Magnolia Lane. He wants to build luxury condos that would overlook our single-family homes." Judge Morgan's expression shifted subtly into what her courtroom opponents called her contemplation face, the calm before a judicial storm. "I've heard about this proposal. Didn't the HOA send a community impact statement opposing it?" "We did, but Hammond has connections on the county commission. Word is they're fast-tracking approval despite zoning concerns." They watched as Daryl, now HOA treasurer, tried to explain that the developer needed to address the meeting, not demand private approval. Hammond's voice carried across the garden as he declared, "I don't need permission from a neighborhood garden club. This development is happening." Karen felt a familiar fire ignite, the same righteous indignation that had once fueled her HOA tyranny, but now channeled toward actual community protection rather than mailbox colors. "We should help Daryl," she said, already moving toward the confrontation. Judge Morgan touched her arm. "Together, but carefully. This is exactly the kind of situation where your detailed knowledge of local regulations could be valuable." Side by side, they approached the developer. Karen couldn't help noticing the poetry of the moment. She and the judge, once adversaries, now presenting a united front against an actual threat to their community. "Mr. Hammond," Karen began with professional courtesy that masked her determination, "I'm familiar with your proposal. Did you know that parcel falls under our neighborhood's extended covenant restrictions?" The sky blue paint on Judge Elaine Morgan's mailbox was still wet when Karen Whitaker slapped the violation notice onto it, smearing the fresh coat she had just scrutinized with a ruler. The president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association stepped back, her platinum bob catching the morning light as she snapped a photo with her phone. Section 17, Paragraph 4. Karen muttered to herself, thumbing through her dog-eared copy of the HOA bylaws. "Mailboxes must be painted whisper white, not." She squinted at the paint can label at Judge Morgan's feet, "Cerulean Dream." Judge Morgan wasn't home. She was presiding over a federal trafficking case, unaware that her weekend painting project, completed by her teenage twins as a surprise while she prepared for the trial, was about to spark a suburban war. Her children had used the wrong shade of paint by a single gradient on the approved HOA color wheel. Karen Whitaker hadn't always been this way. 10 years ago, she was Karen Bennett, a successful real estate agent with a thriving business and a reputation for finding people their perfect homes. Then came the housing market crash, the divorce, and the slow, insidious transformation into the neighborhood's most feared resident. Whispering Pines became her kingdom, the bylaws her constitution, and violations her personal vendetta against a world that had taken everything else from her. As Karen marched down the pristine sidewalk, exactly 4 inches thick, as required by Section 3, Paragraph 11, her phone buzzed. It was Daryl from the Architectural Review Committee. "Karen, about the Morgan situation." "Already handled," she interrupted, voice clipped with satisfaction. First violation issued. But Karen, I was looking at their file, and the homeowner is. I don't care if she's the Queen of England, Daryl. Rules are rules. Karen ended the call as she approached her own home, a perfect exemplar of HOA standards with its whisper white trim and council-approved magnolia saplings. Inside, her dining room had been converted into what she called the compliance center, walls covered with neighborhood maps, violation spreadsheets, and photos documenting infractions. A half-finished glass of Chardonnay sat next to her computer, despite it being only 10:30 in the morning. She uploaded the mailbox photo to her violation database and printed 2 additional copies of the notice, one for the HOA files and one to mail certified. That's when she spotted them across the street, the Morgan twins, Jason and Jessica, staring at the violation notice on their freshly painted mailbox with confused expressions. Something stirred in Karen, a distant memory of her own children, now living with their father in another state. She shook it away. Sentiment was weakness in her position. She squared her shoulders and stepped onto her porch. "Excuse me," she called out. "That color is non-compliant. You have 48 hours to correct it before fines begin accruing at $100 per day." Jessica Morgan, 16 and still wearing her soccer uniform, looked up. "But we checked the color wheel. Blue is allowed." "Whisper blue is allowed," Karen corrected, crossing the street with her bylaws clutched to her chest like a holy text. "This is clearly cerulean, which is precisely 3 shades too vibrant for our community aesthetic." Jason, the quieter twin, pulled out his phone. "Mom's at work. Should I call her?" "Your mother should have consulted the Architectural Review Committee before allowing any modifications," Karen stated, producing a color sample card from her purse. "See? Whisper blue, not cerulean dream." The twins exchanged glances. They'd spent their Sunday surprising their overworked mother with this small home improvement, and now this stranger was telling them it was wrong. "We'll fix it," Jessica finally said, defiance in her eyes. "But I think you're being ridiculous." Karen's lips thinned. "That's another violation. Section 29, Paragraph 2. All interactions between residents must remain courteous and professional." She pulled out her citation pad, beginning to write a second violation notice when Jason's phone rang. He answered, his expression changing as he listened. "It's Mom," he mouthed to his sister. "She wants to talk to the HOA lady." Karen smiled, extending her hand for the phone. This was her favorite part, when homeowners tried to argue their way out of clear violations. She had no idea she was about to speak to federal judge Elaine Morgan, who had just sentenced 3 cartel members to life without parole, and was in absolutely no mood for petty neighborhood tyranny. Judge Morgan nodded, including the $27,000 spent last year on architectural enforcement consultation, with no competitive bidding process, or the $15,000 for community aesthetic training that no board member besides herself attended. Karen's mouth went dry. Those were approved board expenditures by a board that hadn't reached quorum in 18 months according to the meeting minutes. Judge Morgan countered, still unnervingly calm. "And then there's the matter of fine collection without proper appeals process, which violates state law regarding HOA governance." Karen's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her ever-present copy of the bylaws. "Our procedures are outlined clearly in." "I've read the bylaws, Ms. Whitaker. All 342 pages, including the amendments you've added without proper homeowner ratification. I'm particularly interested in the Special Assessment Fund for Landscaping that seems to primarily service properties on Magnolia Lane, where you reside." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Karen had always assumed no one would actually read the Byzantine bylaws she'd crafted over years. Certainly not with a federal judge's trained eye. "What do you want?" Karen asked, abandoning pretense. Judge Morgan leaned forward. "I want a functional, fair HOA. One that protects property values without becoming a vehicle for personal power. I'm still running for the board, but I'm not your enemy, Ms. Whitaker, unless you make me one." "Is that a threat?" Karen bristled. "An observation," the judge replied. "I handle enough adversarial proceedings in my courtroom. I'd prefer cooperation in my neighborhood. Before Karen could respond, her phone chimed with a text. It was from the HOA treasurer. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow. All members attending. Discussion topic: financial review. Karen's face must have betrayed her shock because Judge Morgan smiled slightly. I believe your board members have been doing some reading as well. Transparency often has that effect. After the judge left, Karen poured herself a large glass of Chardonnay and surveyed her command center with new eyes. The maps and violation notices that had given her such satisfaction now seemed obsessive, even to her. When had enforcing mailbox colors become her life's purpose? She picked up a framed photo buried under violation forms, herself with her children and ex-husband in front of their first home, before Whispering Pines, before the housing crash, before she channeled all her loss and disappointment into controlling the minor infractions of others. The emergency board meeting the next day was brutal. Karen watched helplessly as her carefully constructed authority crumbled. The treasurer had questions about expenditures. The secretary questioned the legality of bylaw amendments. Even Daryl, her longtime ally, asked why violation fines had increased 300% under her leadership. We've all been complacent, he admitted, but these practices need to change. When Judge Morgan arrived, invited by the board without Karen's knowledge, the coup was complete. The judge didn't gloat or condemn. She simply presented a reorganization plan that would bring the HOA into legal compliance and create greater homeowner involvement. Karen sat silently through the unanimous vote to adopt the new approach, including a forensic audit of HOA finances. She'd never imagined her reign could end so abruptly. As the meeting concluded, she gathered her belongings, avoiding eye contact with her former supporters. Judge Morgan approached as others filed out. Ms. Whitaker, your organizational skills and attention to detail could be valuable assets if channeled constructively. The board still needs your institutional knowledge. Karen looked up, surprised by the absence of triumph in the judge's voice. Why would you want me involved after everything? Because communities function best with diverse perspectives and skills, including yours, Judge Morgan replied, just without the unchecked authority. Karen stood at a crossroads. Cling to her crumbling empire or adapt to a new reality. Either way, Whispering Pines would never be the same, and neither would she. Karen sipped her Chardonnay, noticing that these days she rarely opened a bottle before sunset. Her phone buzzed with a neighborhood watch alert, a new system Judge Morgan had implemented to replace Karen's violation patrols with actual community security measures. The message read, suspicious developer vehicle photographed taking pictures of drainage easements. Community meeting called for Monday to discuss response strategy. K. Whitaker to present regulatory options. Karen smiled, setting down her glass to begin researching precedents. She still maintained meticulous files, but these days they protected her neighbors rather than policed them. The transformation wasn't complete. She still felt the urge to measure grass height and document paint colors, but she was learning to redirect those impulses toward constructive ends. As dusk settled over Whispering Pines, lights came on in homes where people now waved to Karen, rather than hiding from her approach. The Morgan twins kicked a soccer ball on their front lawn, unconcerned about potential grass violations. Judge Morgan sat on her own porch across the street, reviewing case files, but pausing occasionally to watch her children play. Karen raised her glass in a silent toast to her one-time adversary, who nodded acknowledgement. They weren't quite friends, not yet, but they had become something perhaps more valuable in suburban America, neighbors who had moved beyond peaceful coexistence to active collaboration. Tyler emerged from the house and sat beside his mother. Dad says he might come for the community meeting on Monday. Says he's curious about this new version of you everyone's talking about. Karen put her arm around her son's shoulders, remembering the young mother she'd been before color swatches and violation notices had consumed her identity. I'm curious about her too, she admitted, but I think I'm starting to like her. From her porch, Judge Morgan watched the mother and son with quiet satisfaction. Justice came in many forms, she reflected, sometimes in federal courtrooms, sometimes in community gardens, and sometimes in the slow rehabilitation of a neighborhood tyrant who had simply lost her way. And while the battle with developer Hammond was just beginning, Whispering Pines faced it as a united community rather than a collection of homes bound only by bylaws. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Even Karen Whitaker, who had finally learned the difference between enforcing rules and building community. The HOA still existed, of course. There were still bylaws and regulations and architectural review committees. But under the surface of those necessary structures pulsed something new and powerful, the beating heart of actual neighbors who had discovered they could protect what mattered without sacrificing what made a neighborhood truly valuable, the people who called it home. Federal Judge Elaine Morgan's voice emerged from the phone speaker with the same measured calm she used when addressing defendants in her courtroom. "This is Judge Morgan. To whom am I speaking?" Karen's spine straightened involuntarily, something in that authoritative tone triggering a primal need to stand at attention. Still, she was on her turf now, not in some courtroom. "Karen Whitaker, president of the Whispering Pines HOA. Your children have violated Section 17 of our bylaws with an unapproved mailbox color. I'm simply enforcing the rules all residents agreed to when purchasing property in our community." A brief silence followed, during which Karen could almost hear the judge's controlled breathing. Then, "Ms. Whitaker, my children attempted a kind gesture while I was preparing for a federal case. I'll address the mailbox this weekend. Please withdraw the violation notice." Karen felt a tingle of indignation. No one told her to withdraw violations. That wasn't how this worked. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Ms. Morgan. Rules exist for everyone's benefit. The violation stands, including the 48-hour correction requirement." Jessica's eyes widened at Karen's tone, while Jason nervously shifted his weight. "I understand rules, Ms. Whitaker," the judge replied. "I enforce federal ones daily. But I also understand discretion and proportional response. The mailbox will be repainted this weekend. Then you'll accrue 3 days of fines before compliance," Karen countered, feeling the familiar rush of power. "Additionally, your daughter has violated Section 29 regarding courteous interactions." Something changed in Judge Morgan's voice, the temperature dropping several degrees. "Put my daughter back on the phone, please." Karen handed the phone back with a smug smile. Jessica listened, nodded, and ended the call. "Mom says we should go inside and not worry about this," she told her brother. They retreated into their house, leaving Karen alone with her violation notices and color swatches. Karen considered this a victory as she walked back to her compliance center, unaware that Judge Morgan had just texted her clerk to pull up everything possible on Whispering Pines HOA, its board of directors, and specifically Karen Whitaker. 3 days later, Karen was conducting her morning neighborhood patrol when she noticed a work crew at the Morgan residence. A contractor was carefully painting the mailbox in the exact shade of whisper blue required by the bylaws. Karen approached, citation pad ready. "Do you have an approved work permit for this modification?" The contractor, a burly man with kind eyes, handed her a folder. "All the paperwork's here, ma'am. Signed by your architectural committee yesterday." Karen flipped through the documents, finding everything frustratingly in order, including signatures from board members she hadn't consulted. Her phone rang, Daryl from the committee. On the field, Jessica scored a goal, and the crowd erupted. Karen found herself clapping along, feeling a fragment of genuine joy for the first time in years. The sensation was almost foreign, after so long focused on infractions and control. The following Tuesday, Karen attended the open HOA meeting, her first as a regular resident rather than president. The differences were immediately apparent. The conference room at the community center featured coffee and cookies. Neighbors chatted amiably before the agenda began. Most shocking of all, people were laughing. Judge Morgan conducted the meeting with efficient grace, moving through items with judicial precision while ensuring every resident had an opportunity to speak. When they reached the agenda item, Community Beautification Committee, the judge looked directly at Karen. "We need someone with an eye for detail and appreciation for aesthetics to head this new committee," she announced. someone who understands the difference between whisper blue and cerulean dream. A ripple of laughter moved through the room, but it wasn't entirely unkind. Karen realized the judge was offering her a path to redemption, a way to channel her obsessive attention to detail into community improvement rather than punishment. The role would involve coordinating neighborhood cleanups, managing our community garden project, and yes, providing guidance on appropriate color schemes. Judge Morgan continued. Any volunteers? Karen's hand rose almost involuntarily. The room fell silent, residents exchanging uncertain glances. Then Jessica Morgan raised her hand too. I'll co-chair if Ms. Whitaker wants a partner. Weeks later, Karen stood in the community garden that had once been an unused green space, directing volunteers planting flowers in precisely measured rows. Her clipboard still contained checklists and measurements, but the goal was creation rather than citation. Jessica worked alongside her, their unlikely partnership becoming the talk of Whispering Pines. The teenager's creativity balanced Karen's precision, resulting in a garden design that was both orderly and artistic. You know, Karen said as they planted tulip bulbs for the spring, your mother is surprisingly good at community governance for someone who spends her days in federal court. Jessica grinned. Mom says small justice matters as much as big justice. She also says you're not as terrible as everyone thought. Karen laughed, a genuine sound that surprised nearby volunteers. High praise indeed. As they worked, Karen spotted her ex-husband's car pulling into the community center parking lot. Her heart lurched as her teenage son stepped out, looking taller than when she'd last seen him 6 months ago. He waved tentatively, and Karen set down her clipboard. Excuse me, she told Jessica. There's someone I need to welcome to the neighborhood. The Whispering Pines community newsletter, typically a bland recitation of approved shrub heights and upcoming pressure washing schedules, landed in mailboxes with unprecedented drama that weekend. Karen had outdone herself with the special edition, which featured a front-page editorial titled Preserving Our Community Standards, a call to action. Without naming Judge Morgan directly, a calculated move to avoid potential defamation, Karen painted a vivid picture of judicial overreach, threatening the very fabric of our community aesthetic. The newsletter suggested that certain new residents were attempting to use professional intimidation to circumvent established protocols that maintain our property values. Karen was addressing envelopes for a follow-up mailing when her doorbell rang. Through her peephole, she saw Judge Elaine Morgan standing on her porch, looking surprisingly casual in jeans and a blazer, holding a copy of the newsletter. Karen smoothed her linen pantsuit, fixed her face into a mask of professional courtesy, and opened the door. Judge Morgan, what an unexpected pleasure, she said, voice honeyed with forced politeness. Ms. Whitaker. Judge Morgan nodded, her expression unreadable. May I come in? I believe we should have a conversation without an audience. Karen hesitated, then stepped aside. No one in the neighborhood had been inside her home for months, not since she'd converted her living spaces into HOA command headquarters. Judge Morgan took in the violation maps and color-coded community infractions with raised eyebrows, but said nothing as she settled into the one chair not covered with paperwork. Your newsletter makes for interesting reading, the judge said finally, placing it on the coffee table between them. Karen lifted her chin. I have a duty to keep residents informed about threats that aren't actually threats. Judge Morgan asked mildly. I reviewed our HOA's financial statements. Did you know they're public record for all homeowners? Something cold settled in Karen's stomach. The financial statements weren't technically secret, but she'd been counting on resident apathy to keep them unexamined. Everything is properly documented, she said carefully. 3 weeks after what residents now refer to as the HOA revolution, Karen Whitaker sat alone in her dining room, staring at the bare walls where her violation maps had once hung. The forensic audit was underway, and while no formal accusations had been made, Karen knew questionable transactions would eventually be traced back to her. The doorbell chimed, an unusual occurrence these days, as neighbors now avoided her like foreclosure notices. She opened the door to find Jessica Morgan, of all people, holding a plate of cookies. Mom made these, Jessica said awkwardly. She thought you might like some. Karen accepted the plate with suspicion. Why would she bake for me? Jessica shrugged. She said something about olive branches and community healing. I'm just the delivery person. As the teenager turned to leave, Karen surprised herself by asking, would you like to come in for a minute? Jessica hesitated, then followed Karen into the kitchen, the one room spared from HOA documentation. They sat at the breakfast bar in uncomfortable silence until Karen offered milk with the cookies. You remind me of my daughter, Karen said suddenly. She was about your age when we moved away from our old neighborhood. Jessica nibbled a cookie. Where does she live now? With her father in Colorado. They moved after the divorce. Something in Karen's tone must have revealed more than she intended, because Jessica's expression softened. That must be hard. My parents are divorced too. This simple connection, shared experience rather than bylaws and violations, cracked something in Karen's carefully maintained facade. The conversation shifted to safer topics. Jessica's soccer team, school challenges, the neighborhood in general. When Jessica left, Karen found herself with an unexpected invitation to attend the girls' soccer match the following weekend. The whole neighborhood is coming, Jessica had said. Mom's idea for community building or whatever. The community soccer match became Karen's first public appearance since her HOA presidency imploded. She sat alone on the bleachers until Daryl tentatively joined her, offering a conciliatory cup of coffee. The audit's preliminary findings came in, he said quietly. Karen braced herself. How bad? Not criminal, Daryl replied. Sloppy and self-serving, but not embezzlement. Judge Morgan suggested we handle it internally, restitution rather than prosecution. Relief washed over Karen, followed immediately by confusion. Why would she do that? Daryl watched as Judge Morgan cheered enthusiastically for her daughter on the field. She said something about community justice being restorative, not punitive. Said you had more to offer Whispering Pines than a cautionary tale. The developer dismissed her with a glance. HOA covenants don't override county zoning once approvals are granted. Generally true, Judge Morgan interjected mildly, except when those covenants include infrastructure easements registered with the county prior to current zoning maps, which ours do. Karen nodded, picking up the thread seamlessly. Section 12. Paragraph 7 of our original neighborhood establishment documents. The drainage easement runs precisely through your planned construction site. Hammond's confidence faltered slightly. Who exactly are you people? Concerned residents, Judge Morgan replied, who've done their homework. The confrontation ended with Hammond retreating to consult with his legal team. But the victory felt more significant than any HOA violation Karen had ever issued. This was protecting her community from actual harm, not enforcing arbitrary aesthetic standards. Later, as the garden volunteers shared lunch under the new gazebo, Karen found herself seated between Judge Morgan and Tyler, who was deep in conversation with Jessica about soccer strategies. The simple pleasure of community, of belonging, filled Karen with unfamiliar contentment. You know, Judge Morgan said quietly, when I first moved here, I was concerned about balancing my judicial career with being present for the twins. I never expected the neighborhood itself would become such a support system. I never expected to be part of that system again, Karen admitted. After everything. The judge considered her thoughtfully. People contain multitudes, Ms. Whitaker. The same attention to detail that made you a formidable HOA president makes you an excellent community advocate when properly directed. Karen watched her son laughing with the other teenagers. Do you think people can really change, or do they just find better ways to channel who they've always been? Both, perhaps, the judge replied. The law recognizes rehabilitation as a legitimate outcome of corrective action. Why shouldn't neighborhoods? That evening, Karen sat on her front porch, something she rarely did during her HOA presidency years, when she was too busy patrolling for violations to enjoy her own home. Tyler was inside calling his father, updating him about the garden project he'd joined.